so we can share later, but we're so excited to talk to you today about the Paris Library. Thank you so much for writing this book. It was beautiful to read. We were just talking about before you jumped on, we loved the stories intertwining, trying to figure out how Montana connected with Paris and back and forth. Like it was just such a good read. And I know we have lots of questions for you, but I thought it'd be fun to start with you reading a little bit from your own book.
Yes, sure, why not? Well, I'll read to you the first lines that I wrote. When I was writing this book, I started one way and then it ended up another way. And so we're on page 9 with Lily in Freud, Montana in 1983. Her name was Mrs. Gustafson, and she lived next door. Behind her back, folks called her the war bride, but she didn't look like a bride to me. First of all, she never wore white, and she was old, way older than my parents. Everyone knows a bride needs a groom, but her husband was long dead. Though she spoke 2 languages fluently, for the most part, she didn't talk to anyone. She'd lived here since 1945, but would always be considered the woman who came from somewhere else. She was the only war bride in Freud, much like Dr. Stantfield was the only doctor. I sometimes peeked into her living room, where even her tables and chairs were foreign, dainty like dollhouse furniture, with sculpted walnut legs. I snooped in her mailbox, where letters from as far away as Chicago were addressed to Madame Odile Gustafson. Compared to the names I knew, like Tricia and Tiffany, Odile seemed exotic. Folks said she came from France. Wanting to know more about her, I studied the encyclopedia entries on Paris. I discovered the gray gargoyles of Notre Dame and Napoleon's Arch of Triumph. Yet nothing I read could answer my question. What made Mrs. Gustafson so different? She wasn't like the other ladies in Freud. They were plump like wrens, and their lumpy sweaters and boring shoes came in downy grays. The other ladies wore curlers to the grocery store, but Mrs. Gustafson donned her Sunday best. A red belt always showed off her waist, a pleated skirt and high heels, just to take out the trash. She wore bright lipstick, even in church. That one certainly thinks highly of herself, the other lady said as she strode to her pew near the front, eyes hidden by her cloche hat. No one else wore a hat. And most parishioners sat in back, not wanting to call themselves to God's attention or the priest. So those were the first lines that I wrote of this book. And I wrote the entire Montana section first. And then I got to the Paris section where I started with Odile. Numbers floated around my head like stars. 823. The numbers were the key to a new life. 822. Constellations of hope. 841. In my bedroom late at night, in the morning on the way to get croissants. Series after series. 810, 840, 890. Formed in front of my eyes. They represented freedom, the future. Along with the numbers, I'd studied the history of libraries going back to the 1500s. In England, while Henry VIII was busy chopping off his wives' heads, our King Francois was modernizing his library, which he opened to scholars. His royal collection was the beginning of the Bibliothèque Nationale. Now, at the desk in my bedroom, I prepared for my job interview at the American Library, reviewing my notes one last time. Founded in 1920, the first library in Paris to let the public into the stacks, subscribers from more than 30 countries, 1/4 of them from France. I held fast to these facts and figures, hoping that they'd make me appear qualified to the directress. I strolled from my family's apartment on the city route to Rome, across from the Saint-Lazare train station, where locomotives coughed up smoke. The wind whipped my hair, and I tucked tendrils under my tam hat. In the distance, I could see the ebony dome of the Saint Augustin Church. Religion, 200. Old Testament, 221. And what was the New Testament? I waited, but the number wouldn't come. I was so nervous that I forgot simple facts. I drew my notebook from my purse. Ah, yes, 225. I knew that. My favorite part of library school had been the Dewey Decimal System. Conceived in 1873 by the American librarian Melvin Dewey, it used 10 classes to organize library books on shelves based on subjects. There was a number for everything, allowing any reader to find any book in any library. For example, Mama took pride in her 648, housekeeping. Papa wouldn't admit it, but he really did enjoy 785, chamber music. My twin brother was more of a 636.8 person, while I preferred 636.7, dogs and cats, respectively. I arrived on the Grand Boulevard, and where in the space of a block, the city shrugged off her working class mantle and donned a mink coat. The coarse smell of coal dissipated, replaced by the honeyed jasmine of joy, worn by women delighting in the window display of Nina Ricci's dresses and Kislov's green leather gloves. Farther along, I wound around the musicians exiting the shop that sold wrinkled book sheet music, past the Baroque building with the blue door, and turned the corner onto a narrow side street. I knew the way by heart. I loved Paris, a city with secrets, like book covers, some leather, some cloth. Each Parisian door led to an unexpected world. A courtyard could continue a knot of bicycles or a plump concierge armed with a broom. In the case of the library, a massive wooden door opened to a secret garden. Bordered by petunias on one side, lawn on the other, the white pebbled path led to the brick and stone mansion. I crossed the threshold, beneath the French and American flags flittering side by side, and I hung my jacket on the rickety coat rack, breathing in the best smell in the world, the melange of the mossy scent of musty books and crisp newspaper pages. I felt as if I'd come home.
Thank you
Real.
so much.
Oh, thank you.
So nice to hear the author read her own words.
Do you happen to read the audiobook for, oh, we have a visitor. Do you happen to read the audiobook versions of your book?
I only read the author's note for the Paris Library, but the others, I think there were three other, there were actresses that actually read. I don't know if I could do that long term. It's really hard. I think my author's page was like 5 pages, and at the end I was like,
I feel that. But you were so good. It was so nice to listen to. So if you ever decide to, we'll be waiting.
Yeah, so since I'm losing my voice a little bit, I have a bit of a cold. Sorry, Janet. I have Mandy here, and we have some questions we wanted to ask you, and then the readers wanted to ask you some questions. So
Sure, with
we'll
pleasure.
a couple. I'll let Mandy.
Yes. Nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Crystal's voice today.
Nice to meet you.
So we have lots of questions, and reading about your history, obviously it's kind of clear why you wrote this book, but can you talk kind of more about your life and how you got inspired to write this particular story?
Well, I think if there's something I'm good at, it's taking minimum wage jobs and turning them into novels. And so when I was working in Odessa, Ukraine, I was working as a teacher, and I signed a contract that said I would receive 120% of a head teacher's salary, which sounded very good to me. I earned $25 a month, and my rent was $100 a month. But I think work is a really great place because you just meet so many different people from so many different walks of life. And there's that friction there because people, you're not family, you're not friends. You've got to find a way to get along and kind of see eye to eye. And so I have always appreciated my different jobs for that purpose. And so when I worked at the American Library in Paris, I had just finished kind of promoting my book, The Moonlight in Odessa, and I was living in Paris. And as Crystal knows, every so often by law, Parisian facades have to be cleaned. And so our apartment building, which is a huge building complex, and very modern. And so what that meant was, I think there were like at least 8 buildings attached to each other. So when they dropped the hammer on the scaffolding of building 18, I'm in 12, and you could hear it. It was just like it was happening above your head. And so I couldn't work in my own apartment anymore. And so I was having lunch with Anne Ma, who was the programs manager at the American Library in Paris. And she was mentioning that she was moving on from the job to write full time. And she really made the job sound great. And so I applied and got the job. I had been a volunteer there for several years, leading creative writing workshops. So I already knew the library and felt a part of the community. And so I was working in an open space office, which is great when you're a writer because you hear everything. I don't think it's great when you're an employee because you hear everything. And you kind of don't want to hear everything. You just want to be in your own work. But my colleague, Nida Kulshaw, who is just an amazing, amazing person. She's a professor and now she lives in Grenoble, but she was the curator of all of the events, the exhibits at the time. And so she was doing an exhibit of Ruth, I think her name is Ruth McBurney. She was a librarian from Idaho who came to Paris right after World War II. And her view about Paris was just completely fascinating. So Nida was asking questions of the collections manager who has been there since the Nixon administration. So he knows everything. And so they were talking about all of the librarians, and he was the one who mentioned Boris Nechayev and Dorothy Reeder during World War II. And so I got curious about it and I started Googling and looking through the American Library Association archives online. And I read Dorothy Reeder's report marked confidential. I think it's about 11 pages. And it details life in Paris right before the occupation and during the occupation. And it just gave me chills. And I wanted to know more. And I wanted to give readers those same chills. So about the time that the scaffolding came down from my apartment building, it was time to write that novel.
That's amazing. Thank you. That was the next on my list of questions is which of these characters are real and who, how do you as an author decide how to play with the truth with fiction when it's historical fiction?
Well, I have a wonderful PowerPoint presentation on my other computer that I
darn.
was going to show you with some really fascinating photos of Dorothy. Like Dorothy Reeder is just gorgeous. She's just amazing. And the Countess is really interesting. So I have family photos from Boris's daughter. So maybe in 5 minutes, I'll go see if the computer is alive and maybe I can clock back into that computer just to show you a few photos because it really is nice to put the names and faces together of these real life heroes. I think for me, it was very hard to put myself in Dorothy Reeder's position because I had such esteem for her. She was such an incredible woman. In the summer of 1939 and again in the spring of 1940, the American ambassador William Bullitt told Americans in France, leave now. And these librarians decided to stay. And I just think that's so incredibly courageous. Of course, now we know that Paris was occupied and that it wasn't bombed. But at the time, they didn't know that. And actually, parts of Paris were bombed. I think if you read Kristen Harmel's The Paris Daughter, that's a big plot point in her book because her characters lived in the area of Paris that was bombed. And her author's note on that is really incredible. So I highly recommend The Paris Daughter and read the author's note first because it is fascinating. I love the research that writers do on their novels. So I really felt a lot of admiration for Dorothy Reeder, and it was really hard for me to put words in her mouth because I was afraid of getting it wrong or that maybe she didn't quite sound like that. There's a lot of research about her saying that she's full of pep and she's got a great sense of humor and everybody loved her, but there are very few specific lines of what she said. And so I created Odile because putting words in the mouth of my own creation was a lot easier for me to do. And so that was one of the reasons that I created Odile. I also wanted to have that connection to Montana. I'm from small town Montana. And if there's one thing I wanted to show in this book, it's that you don't have to be from a big city like Paris or an adult to have a rich inner life. You can be a teenage girl in small town America and still have very interesting thoughts, have a rich inner life. So that was why I didn't I chose to have a fictional character be the narrator. Those two reasons.
I love that. How much that then brings my next question is how much of Lily is you? How much of that overlaps? Are there any parallels there?
You know, I think Odile is me because,
Mm.
you know, I think, and Crystal can talk about this too when she gets her voice back. It's really challenging to live in a foreign country and go through all the paperwork and to kind of deal with, like, when you first get here, you kind of get the same comments from people, and that can kind of be hurtful at times. I know when I first got here, it was like, oh, you're American, McDonald's, ketchup, hamburger. And, you know, once people get to know you, those kind of things kind of go by the wayside, but they are kind of hard at first, or those kind of the way that you're judged before you even open your mouth, sometimes with your accent when you do open your mouth. And so Odile really had to deal with that, of being a foreigner, a very obvious foreigner in a place where there were no foreigners. And it's very hard, it's very challenging. And so I feel like I'm more Odile than Lily. I think the thing I have in common with Lily is I just wanted out when I was that age. I just wanted out. But you know, I have a very loving parents. I did not have a stepmother. I did not have little brothers. So that part of the story is really invented, except for that desire of wanting out and thinking bigger is better when bigger is just bigger. But I can see why people would think, oh, you must be Lily because you're both from Montana. But there we go.
Thank you for clearing that up. Then are there any other parallels to your life besides then your relation with Odile and being, you know, a foreigner? Or there are other fun details about living in Paris that you've kind of weaved in? For example, like when you're walking on Rue de Rome, were you thinking, you know, were you kind of going, okay, this is where they're going to live? Or did you already live in that area? I don't know if that question is making sense.
No, I based the library's location on where it was in 1939. And so I just went for a day walking around that neighborhood, and it's all of the cities are named in that area are named after cities. So you have Rue d'Amsterdam, Rue de Rome. So it's really interesting to see all the different city names. But the library itself was destroyed. It's the only building on the Rue de Téhéran that was destroyed, and now it's a glass building with probably 6 or 7 stories. But it was at one point the Dannon Yogurt headquarters, and a bookseller from Lille who opened up her bookshop when she was middle-aged after converting from the corporate world to bookselling, reached out to me, and she said the courtyard behind that big building is still the library courtyard. So I don't know if it's still true today, but when she was working there, the courtyard that I just described in my reading is still there. So it's nice to think that a piece of the library is still there.
Yeah, that's
How was it
beautiful.
destroyed?
Pardon?
How was it destroyed?
You know, I think the building itself, it was what they call a hotel particulier. So it was a mansion, and then a paved a courtyard paved with cobblestone. And I think I think businesses just wanted to use that space in a corporate way rather than a private way. But it was tragic because I think Crystal has probably seen too the library information card from that time, the one that's in the book. So that's what I was expecting to see when I went to the Rue de Téhéran. We were talking about different cities. So you have the Rue de Rome, then you have Téhéran Street. So that's what I was expecting. So yeah.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about libraries kind of as a source of fact and as a place to be counted on in kind of our world with changing information and fake news and all of this stuff? How important are libraries in our current world?
Well, I think libraries have pivoted more than any other kind of institution. When you think about when the internet came, people were saying, oh, we won't need libraries, you'll be able to stay at home and get the information. But I know that libraries, for example, if you have a job interview and you need to check out a jacket or a tie, in some libraries you can do that. Or if you need a power saw or some other kind of tool for the weekend, if you're renovating a DIY job, you can rent those tools. So I think that libraries, in Minneapolis, there's a toy library. So instead of getting like those plastic toys that your kids are interested in for like exactly 6 weeks, you can just use them from the library and give them back. So it's wasting less plastic, it's teaching your kids to share. I just think it's incredible. The adulting classes, I know there are a lot of adulting classes, and those I think actually originated in a library in Oregon, where schools aren't teaching how to sew on a button or balance, or schools or families aren't teaching how to balance a checkbook or a budget or sew on a button. So these are basic cooking things. So I really love how libraries look individually at their communities to see what, in addition to books, I follow the Miami library on social media, and they always help with taxes. So I think that's really interesting that they'll have a tax professional come in, and you can make an appointment with a tax professional in April, and they will help you get your taxes sorted out. So I think that's a really special thing, that when libraries are close to their communities like that and can offer so many things. I know in my library in Shelby, Montana, in our community of 2000, our population doubled overnight because they got a huge private prison. And so the prisoners obviously don't come into Shelby, but the library shows their art. So a small piece of them can come into the community, can come into the library, and people can kind of see their talent. And so I really think that's beautiful, that in a small way they can become part of the community.
That's amazing. I love
Without
that.
talking about books. I haven't even talked about books, but I'm just amazed. You know, my sister, she's very busy. She's got 10 horses, 30 chickens. She drives an hour to work and an hour back because she lives in the country. And I got her 3 ebooks, or not ebooks, audiobooks through Libro FM. And she listens to them on the way to work and back. And she liked it so much that she subscribed to the local library. And now she reads more than me. When she's doing her chores, when she's in the car, she probably reads minimum 4 books a week. So I think that's just incredible how libraries are doing so much with technology and bringing books to people who maybe traditionally didn't have the time to read.
Totally. Stephanie commented, I love that libraries are one of the only, if not the only places in the United States where you can go and spend time without spending money. I think that's such an important part.
Yes, such an excellent point. That is an excellent point. Yes, because everything costs money, and you can just go and enjoy. And a lot of times there are art exhibits. So yes, it's there. I love books. Obviously, I'm an author. I love reading, but I love how the library is also a community center. Yes, it's really important.
So also, before you logged on, Stephanie had mentioned that she saw that you were in writing this book, you had discovered other amazing library stories and other ways that libraries and librarians have affected history or their communities. So is that what's next? Is that what this following? We saw that you've written another book.
Oh yes, I have. I just got a book on eBay. Just let me find it. I'll just read you like a paragraph from it.
And then, yes, if anyone else has any other questions, you can feel free to, when this one's done, you guys can shout them out.
I'm a little Twitter-pated today because my editor from New York was visiting this week. Oh, what happened? I touched something. Oh, here we go. There we go. I'm sorry. So I got this book, which is super old. Shall Angels Weep Again by Mary Needham. She was, my new book is called Miss Morgan's Book Brigade, and it is about the Comité Américain des Régions Dévastées, so the American Committee for Devastated France. 90% of northern France was destroyed in World War I, and we don't really ever learn about it, but the people in that section of northern France, the men, the able-bodied men, were either in the army, prisoners of war, or dead. So basically it was women, children, and old men that were left. So there was a point where some of the people evacuated and some chose to stay. The ones that chose to stay were under occupation of the German soldiers for 3 years. And they did slave labor, working 10 hours a day in the field, even children. And then in 1917, the Germans were pushed back by the Allies. And what happened was the Germans were told to destroy everything. So just like in World War II, there was an occupation. And just like in World War II, Paris, Germans were billeted in villagers' homes. So they lived with the French people, and they got the orders to leave, and they got the orders to destroy everything. So they didn't just leave. They hacked down all the trees in the orchard. They put landmines in the fields. They ripped the cushions and pillows and stuffing out of the mattresses. They destroyed photos. Anything that they could destroy, they did. And it's really remarkable because they lived in these people's homes for years, and they still destroyed everything that these people owned. And so the American Committee was started by Anne Morgan and her longtime love, Anne Marie Dyke. And so these two women with a handful of other women ended up having their headquarters in northern France in a city named Blérancourt. And they basically brought a huge amount of help to these women and children in northern France. And there were so many villages. And so each village had a godmother or marraine. And so here we are with this woman, Mary Needham Master, who comes, and she's one of the marraines. 2 villages were assigned to me, Saint-Aubin and Senlis. The first day I went to Saint-Aubin, I found on its outskirts a large woman digging in a pile of debris. When I asked her what she was searching for, she straightened up into what seemed an Amazonian proportions. She burst into a lusty laugh as she retorted, "For 2.5 years, my parents and I haven't had a fork to eat with." I was wondering whether in that pile, it was once a house, you know, I could find a fork, perhaps even a knife and spoon. I told her that I was the marraine or godmother of her village. How she slapped her broad hips outlined too clearly in the narrow garment of sacking which she had constructed herself. And she looked at me and roared, you little cabbage, you, our godmother?" She was, I think, the only one in the village whose laugh I ever heard. She took me that day to her battered home, where lived her mother and father, both in their 80s. Abruptly and rather too energetically, she prevented me from sitting on a chair, explaining that one of the legs had been sawed off. "Oh la la, those Germans, they didn't even leave us a chair. Here's a nice rough box, sit on that." So it's just to say, you know, I mean, houses reduced to rubble where they don't even have their cutlery anymore, that chairs, the legs hacked off the chairs, you know, I mean, it was just really tough conditions. And so this international group of women came in and just really helped rehabilitate everything over 6 years. So, and one of them was the librarian named Jessie Carson, who was from the New York Public Library and introduced something in France, which they did not have here yet, which was children's libraries and open stacks.
Wow.
That's amazing. I think I can speak for everyone who say it's all added to our Goodreads to be read book
Well,
list.
I didn't know about it. You know, you always hear about the occupation of World War II, but I had no idea about the occupation of World War I. But when I was reading for the Paris Library, I read a lot of books written by French women who lived through the period, and a lot of them always said that the Germans were correct. And correct in French means properly. They behaved properly, not correctly, but properly. And I always thought that was a weird thing to point out. Why are they saying is it correct? And I think it's because in northern France, they were not. I think that in northern France, the occupation was much more brutal.
Definitely. And it's true. I've not ever read about that part of the occupation or World War One in that way. So it's a really fascinating distinction that they made, saying they're correct versus, you know, whatever they were.
Total animals.
Yeah. Any of the other book club members have any questions? Feel free to jump in.
I'm just curious about going back to one of your early inspirations when you read that 11-page memo or notes by Miss Reader. What did she write it for? Like, what was that part of her personal diary or?
It was a report marked confidential to the American Library Association. So she was writing to let the American Library Association, her colleagues there, know what the conditions in Paris were.
Okay.
So presumably it's written before she went back to the States. So it was written during her time
She
there.
wrote it in the summer of 1941. So she was in Paris at the beginning, right before she was there. I think she became directress in 1936. She was there at the beginning of the occupation. And then because the trustees knew that eventually Germany and America would be at war, she would be considered an enemy alien. And so they told her to leave. And so she followed that advice.
I had first all the compliments in the world. This book, the details, the love for books, and the world building, I felt like I was in the story. I found myself reading this more slowly than I usually read books because I didn't want it to end. So I would like read a couple sentences and just enjoy the atmosphere and being there, you know, till later on in the story. But my question is, with that, with your details and the world building, for you, when you are writing, do you see it in your head first and it's like you're transcribing it? Or are you crafting and building this world one detail at a time?
I think it's more one detail at a time. You know, I went to in Fontainebleau Real Books, which I don't know if you get a chance to go to Fontainebleau very often, but they have a bookstore called Real Books. I love it. And every year they used to have a get together for writers, and at the Christmas market in Fontainebleau there would be an author invited. And one year it was a wonderful children's author named Babette. Was it Babette Cole? I can't remember her last name. Someone asked her about writing the stories, and she said, "My dead best friend sits at the end of my bed and tells them to me." And I genuinely did not know if that was true or not with her delivery. I couldn't tell if she was kind of had that question like 1,000 times, or if she was serious. But I did kind of think it would really be nice if I had a friend who would sit at the edge of my bed and tell me stories. But she writes wonderful children's books. Babette Cole, I think is her name. Highly recommended.
Is there like, since you've done so much research for, you know, your new book, and you've discovered even more information, I'm sure, since writing the Paris Library, is there anything that you would have done differently with the Paris Library, the way you wrote it?
No, I think that it was written the way it was written, but I do think it is interesting to keep researching. Like I finished the book, the Miss Morgan's Book Brigade 2 years ago. And I'm still so interested in the cards. There were 300, the Comité Américain des Régions Dévastées, CARD was the acronym, and they called themselves the cards. And so I'm still so interested in the cards that when I saw that one of them had a book come up on eBay for $19, I just had to get it. And you could just see from the small excerpt I read you why I would want to have that book and treasure it. So even though I finished 2 years ago, handed the manuscript in, all done, I think these are people who stay with you.
And what are you currently working on? Do you have something new in the works?
Right now I'm going on a 9-city book tour. So I'm starting in New York and I'm finishing in Chicago and going to, I think, like Boston, Dallas, some other places. So I'm preparing the PowerPoints for that. And I am also trying to place some articles. There's a I would really like to talk about where Anne Morgan was in Paris and what she did. I think the New York Times has a In the Footsteps of column. And I think it's a really interesting column because you can kind of trace where people were. And Anne Morgan is one of the only people. Well, if you go to Les Invalides, which is I guess the it's where Napoleon is buried, but it's also the museum of the French army. They have about 30 huge marble plaques, and those marble plaques are usually for organizations like the Algerian army or this group of doctors who helped during wartime. And the only individual that is thanked is Anne Morgan. And they call her on that plaque a generous and intrepid friend of France. And so I'm just kind of trying to figure out if I can place an article about her in a newspaper, just so people have a better understanding of who she is, what she did, where she went, and the impact. Because, for example, she has a French postal stamp in her honor, which I don't think there are that many American women who have French postal stamps made in their honor. So I think that's really unique and rare, but she is certainly deserving with everything she did in France during and after World War II, during World War I and World War II.
Yeah, definitely bringing a spotlight to all these like unsung heroes.
Yeah.
Library people, we would never know about them really. Thanks to this book, we know a lot more about them. And did anyone else have questions for Janet?
I have a question, and I loved the book. I've been a library lover since I was a little girl and usually have a rotating stack, so I'm there every week. But I was curious about the snooping and how Lily did not seem to learn her lesson after a couple incidences. And I was curious what prompted that. And it was it was kind of amusing, actually.
Well, you got to feel sorry for kids in the 80s because they didn't have the internet, so they had to snoop themselves. You know what I mean? Like now you can creep on someone online. You don't even have to leave your own house. I mean, back then you had to do everything yourself. It's not easy. At least they didn't have like cameras on the doorbell, but like we do now. But no, I think, I think teenagers, especially kind of, she was a younger teen at the beginning of the book. It's just hard to understand boundaries. It's hard to understand no. It's hard to feel like there's only one person who's interesting in your town who might get you. If only she would open up and be your friend, and maybe there's a way to get to her or learn something about her. I do think what she did was really wrong, going into those letters and having those worst assumptions about someone. But at the same time, Odile never really talked about anything. And so I think it's very hard to never say anything to a teen and then expect them to miraculously be adult and understanding.
And I think to that end too, I feel like Odile, the way she left Paris and the guilt she seemed to take with her, that maybe that Lily misinterpreted or misread it at sometimes as something even more so. Because I know I did. I didn't know what the big secret was, throughout the book. So maybe the way she portrayed herself too, because she was still carrying such a burden, that Lily read that and just, desperately wanted to know what she was holding on to.
Well, that's beautifully put. She felt guilty, and it wasn't clear what she might have felt guilty about. It is hard. I think one thing readers have had a hard time about is the fact that Odile went no contact. I think that's very hard if you come from a happy family. It's very hard to understand why someone might want to go no contact with their super religious families. If religion is something to you that is something that brings people together and makes people more community minded rather than maybe judgy or harsh or unforgiving. So I know there are a lot of people who and I empathize with them, who can't understand. I mean, I think when Odile went no contact, it wasn't even a phrase. Now we say it's even an NC, like people can go NC or LC, no contact or low contact or no contact, no contact or low I can't say it. Why can't I say it? This is why I'm not reading my own audiobook. And so I think that's really, it is, people think it's a modern phenomena, but it's not. People did leave the country, people did leave continents, people did start all over again, even back then.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that the no contact was actually exacerbated by the lack of communication that we have now. Like if you decided to leave to the other side of the world at that time, you just couldn't sort of like be in contact. So it was even more of a decision, like you knew that was going to be it.
Well, and I really, one of my greatest memories of researching this book was all the research that I did on the war brides, because the war brides, this book for like 5 years was called The War Bride, because there was a lot of emphasis on her life as a war bride. There were so many war brides, for example, who never called their mother-in-laws by their first name. They were always Mrs. Jones or Mrs. Smith. And when the war brides arrived, a lot of time, especially in smaller communities, it was like they had stolen someone's high school sweetheart or taken someone who did not belong to them. And there was a lot of frustration. They were foreigners. So I felt so bad for a lot of these war brides who were not able to go back, or they didn't even understand who their husbands were, because they were seeing them in uniform with short hair. And so they weren't even having an idea of what their personality was. Sometimes there were language, where they didn't understand each other's language very well. So it was kind of a double-blind experiment where the women didn't know who the men were, but the men didn't know who the women were either. So you kind of got to know each other after you were married, which is, I think, a really hard way to. And then divorce was such a big deal at the time. And a lot of times financially, it was impossible for the French women to return. Jennifer, were you going to say something?
Yes, I apologize because I do read a couple books at the same time, but I'm pretty sure when you made the comment about religion, this was the book that mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses, wasn't it? If they were in Paris?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. So sorry, because oh no, it is on page 14. I finally found it. Does France have Jehovah's Witnesses too?
Oh,
and that struck me because I was raised in that, and people, don't like to use the word cult, but it is. And I just thought, oh, usually when I read that, the author has had some kind of connection or been in part of a family where they had witnesses, because they are big on no contact and shunning, which is what my family does because we left. So it's very much practiced modern day in that religion.
Yeah, it would be very hard. Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot about that reference, but yeah, I think I referenced it because you do see Mormons on what is it when they do their year-long journey?
Like a pilgrimage or
They do a year of service, but outside of the US usually. I can't remember what it's called. And then I did see my husband's grandmother, a mission, thank you, yes. And my husband's grandmothers lived in this teeny tiny village of like 100 people. And so they would have Jehovah Witnesses come and knock on their door. And that really surprised me. It just really surprised me.
I just wanted to briefly touch on, because I agree, the no contact was, it startled me at first. It was a lot for me to think about, but then thinking about the trauma that she went through during the war and losing her closest ally in Remy, in her family, and then dealing with her father's affair and all of that trauma that she had on her. And then I remembered Aunt Carol, and I wonder if it was easier for her to be the one to break the ties rather than have her mother go against her, like she saw her go against her own sister when they were younger because of divorce. So, and that's such a natural human reaction to be the one that, okay, well, I'll leave first before they can hurt me. That I wonder if that was part of her motivation as well. And then I also wondered, would the mother have reacted in the same way given what she had learned and gone through during the war?
Such good questions. I think probably Odile did want to reject before she was rejected. I don't know how the mother would have reacted, because I think there was Eugenie, the friend, and I think that maybe the mother would have had someone like Eugenie and to maybe talk to, or maybe Eugenie would have maybe straightened out the mother. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I like to think it would have been true. And I think sometimes in life, things that happen to us where we're like, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. People are just going to be so horrified and they barely even notice. It's not even on their radar because they have their own issues that they're dealing with. But especially when you're young, I think that's true. And Odile was really young. I don't know if you have this book on your radar, but there's a book called The Journal of Helen Baer, Berr, and it's the true story. It's a journal of a young Jewish woman who lived through I shouldn't say lived through, because she was arrested and sent to a concentration camp where she died, but she lived through the first few years of the occupation. And she's very young and she's very naive, but also very lucid. And it's a book that probably took me a year to read because it's so lively and beautiful. And of course, we all know the end. But I highly recommend this book because it's such a beautiful book. And I think it's so important for us to hear the voices of the people who are actually there. But her book was one that I really, when I was thinking about Odile's voice and what it was like to be a 20-year-old at that time in Paris, that was one of the books that was really important to me.
Well, anybody else have any questions for Janet? I really appreciate you chatting with us today. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
So great.
Wow.
And we can't wait to read the next one. And congrats on the book tour. That sounds fantastic.
Oh, I think it'll be fun. Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Yes. Well, thank you so much for reading the book and for choosing it for your book club. Crystal, thank you so much for this invitation. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
You were so lovely, and your book was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah, and maybe in the next newsletter, I can share some of the pictures that we couldn't get on the PowerPoint.
Yes,
would be
yes.
great because I'm sure people would love to see that.
Oh,
If
yes.
you guys want to hear more from Janet, she was on the podcast Love You Creative. I'll share that in the newsletter too. You can listen to our interview. And thank you guys for coming today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.